Thank you again for joining session 3 of the Jupiter workshop. Let's begin with seeing if any one of you has questions. You can type your question, or I can have you speak and give you a microphone. So last time we covered Jupiter in the different houses and signs, and I believe that we got to Libra. So let's just continue and continue understanding this archetype by using it in the other side, and then we're going to use some examples. In the last session, we're going to talk about the Jupiter cycles with other planets and a touch on the Jupiter in Capricorn that's coming up. So Jupiter in Scorpio in the 8th house, Jupiter, Pluto, conjunctions, very powerful, of course. Think about Jupiter being the largest planet, Pluto being the smallest planet, and both Sagittarius and Scorpio having to do with growth, development, and yet in a very different way, because we can see that Jupiter is big in size, and so it makes sense that Jupiter would represent abundance and development and growth, and size is everything for Jupiter. But from a Scorpio point of view, growth is not necessarily visual. It's not something you can measure mechanically or in the material world. It's soul growth, emotional growth, and internal empowerment. So that's why you can see the planet Pluto being so small, so distant, so slow because of that, and yet not any less effective, powerful, and challenging. But how does this, the Scorpio archetype has to do with growth through shadow work? So in order to empower ourselves, in order to transform, we have to face all the insecurities, everything that is holding us back in our patterns, in our mindsets. And so ultimately, Jupiter in Scorpio is striving to really touch on the deepest sense of power. That combination of Scorpio and Jupiter is again very ecstatic at its core, but also a bit of a hard medicine. If Jupiter in general has to do with growth and abundance and success, wisdom, when it's in Scorpio, we're talking about magical powers. We're talking about sometimes the type of power that is not necessarily, again, very palpable, very tangible, psychic powers, because it has to do with magic. It has to do with bridging the spiritual forces of Jupiter with the transformational and emotional intensity of Scorpio. So together, there is really intention or a need to resolve the riddles of life, to get to the greater depth. So the sovereignty of Jupiter in Scorpio is the type of mastery that has to do with knowing the secrets, knowing how to reach, you know, our goals, how to expand, how to manifest the destiny, the reality that we intend by going through the shadows, by solving those riddles, by knowing the unseen. And it takes a lot of courage. So one of the applications, if we speak now, about the process of expansion, Jupiter in Scorpio is like an elixir, a secret potion that if you receive, you can actually, you know, redefine your capacity, your powers, and get to a completely new level of expression. Now, this sounds very abstract. How does it work in everyday life? We'll find out. But as far as the sovereignty of Jupiter in Scorpio, we can see people who possess tremendous wisdom and who can be masterful in surviving every crisis because they have or they discover, it's not something you're necessarily born with, but you can gather this knowledge as you go through your life experiences. So Jupiter in Scorpio can go through crisis, but there is such a resourcefulness, a capacity to transmute, to use crisis into opportunities. So these are people who can, raise from rags to riches, lose everything, and reinvent themselves in ways that can, be titanic, massive, but usually following some kind of deconstruction, fall from grace, injustice, or loss of some sort. So there's definitely life, you know. Uh, it's almost like if you have Jupiter in Scorpio, or it's transiting your eighth house, or your Pluto, you may come through a shock, a revelation, a rupture. Everything that you believed in may be shattered. And from those pieces, it's as if every one of those shattered pieces will now grow into magnificent, massive trees. And instead of having one, you're going to have many. So from the ashes, you are going to have this, tremendous new opportunity. I personally, went through some of these experiences, very, very deep transformation during Jupiter and Scorpio cycles. Some of them really very, very dark. I'm going to talk into that. But and other historical examples of Jupiter, Pluto, Jupiter, Scorpio. One of them is Nelson Mandela, born with Jupiter, Pluto conjunct in Cancer. And, we know the story. He fought the apartheid in South Africa, spent 27 years or so in prison, never giving up. And from those difficulties, rising to become the first Black prime minister in South Africa, and obviously, marking a completely new era. Another example is Gandhi, Jupiter, Pluto in Scorpio, in Taurus. And both of them, experienced tremendous racism. Part of their shadow work was to work through the prejudice and the evil of racism. And they lost everything. They lost their careers. They lost their freedom. Jupiter is the freedom. They went to the underworld and then re-emerge victors, but not just victors. They re-emerge mythical figures. They grew to become uh, symbols of hope and symbols of nonviolence and um, changing the way people think. On the other hand, people like Ron Hubbard, who was the founder of the Church of Scientology, born with Jupiter in Scorpio on the nose. And we're going to talk probably tomorrow about Jupiter on the nose. It's very, very interesting. Think about inventing a religion and Jupiter's on your nose. And obviously his religion has to do with something that is completely uh, redefining the concept of religion in itself and involving many different doctrines and extraterrestrial forces and of a lot of shadow involved with Scientology, intimidation and corruption and a lot of secrecy. Like you can see with Ron Hubbard, the really dark side of Scientology and that whole concept of hiding the truth, trying to own power through secrets, through magical powers. But that's one of the problems, that's one of the risks of Jupiter in Scorpio. If you are not aligned and if you are not in integrity, it can lead to a intoxication of power. And this means that you 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 may want power at every cost. So it can be very malefic, merging with spiritually dark forces that will give you the promise of, victory, or, you'll get what you want if you sign this contract with the devil. So there's a temptation to, especially in times when you are destitute, when you lost everything, there's a temptation to, reclaim your sovereignty by devious means. But pushing those boundaries, you can really get to a place of tremendous depth. Another example of Jupiter in Scorpio, I think close to the nose as well, is David Bowie, the singer. And he was obviously a very popular singer, but that's not the end of this. He embodied a lot of these ancient myths. You see his makeup, third eye, and this Martian uh, persona that he adopted. Like he incorporated a lot of mysticism and secret knowledge in the concept of his art and work. And when you look at David Bowie, he has that mystical presence. There's something, we refer to him as an alien, but it's not just the alien. There's something magical about him. There's something that captures that Jupiter in Scorpio mysticism. Now, the new frontier can, as we said, be um, tremendous popularity, tremendous wealth, and the ability, to expand in ways that, you know, could only occur after the earth is fertilized by death. So another aspect of Jupiter in Scorpio in its growth is the psychological understanding. So these are people who can come with very deep knowledge about human development, about wounds, therapy. Um, they can develop techniques and understanding about um, what ticks us, how to become powerful beings themselves. So they can be people who have the power to re-empower the wounded ones, heal those psychic wounds, those emotional wounds. Now, the transition to the spiritual plane, we touched on this already. What can happen with Jupiter and Pluto, Jupiter and Scorpio, is actually a very deep crisis in belief, spiritual crisis. Because in order for you to find your truth, to realize, that higher meaning, you may need to deconstruct everything that came before. Naturally, this will lead to people with Jupiter and Scorpio getting sooner or later in the course of their lives very suspicious of anything spiritual. It may be that in a past life, whatever they believed in was revealed to be false or corrupt. So they may have been devotees of a particular path or practice, and the guru abused them, or they realize it was all a scam, and so they become, they're wounded in their spirituality. Now, this can lead to a wound that, makes them atheists and non-believers, or it's a wound that will be projected onto the personification of spirituality. In other words, they're not wounded by God, but they're wounded by the human aspect of spirituality and distrust organized religions. They are going to be very suspicious of people who claim to know, who claim to, have some kind of spiritual knowledge. So Leah is sharing, I have Jupiter retrograde and progress Jupiter Scorpio. Do I lead my life more as Jupiter Scorpio Sagittarius? So the natal chart is always the reference point. The progressions and transit are the second layer. So you are working with whatever natal signature you have, but the progression will be a sub-phase of your development. So back to Jupiter in Scorpio specifically, there is going to be tremendous doubt. In order for you to crack them open, they need to test you. They need to verify, that what you mean, what you say, that you can walk your talk. So naturally, they are going to be also confrontational on an intellectual level, on a spiritual level. These, we remember that Jupiter is also your voice and your perception of life. So when it is in Scorpio, you may, be the silent observer and the one who sees fraud in, what other people believe in blindly. So these are people that are usually not going to just follow the herd or be easily indoctrinated. They have very fierce defense mechanisms. Sometimes it's healthy, it's important to doubt and not just get carried away with beliefs. But on the other hand, it can be a very serious wound where they become afraid of the the how to put it, the spiritual realm or the ethereal, what's not physical and tangible. But remember, this doubt comes from a wound, come from disappointment, come from an experience of abuse in a spiritual context. But this doubt can also be projected onto any kind of Jupiterian energy, which means these are people that um, are not going to be good, easy customers when you want to sell them something. You're telling them, come to the retreat, it's going to be wonderful. We're going into nature. And they're going to say, you're just trying to sell me your retreat. And you don't really mean all the things you said. It's not just, the doubt is not just on spiritual matters. It can be on anything you promise, anything you're proclaiming, anything you're trying to sell, or anything that sounds too good to be true. Like Jupiter in Scorpio is suspicious of whatever glitter. It's not necessarily gold. And as we said, that is part of the experience of the underworld. They've been there. They've seen, the shadows. And if we speak on a current context, remember 2017, Jupiter moved into Scorpio, and you had this whole Me Too movement explode just a week within the movement of Jupiter in Scorpio. And you could see again this exposure of a very powerful figure who had this very secret, dark, sexual agendas. And the Harvey Weinstein and what's his name, the Leo actor. Anyway, many big names were exposed in a very unflattering to begin with, but abusive position. And as it is with Scorpio, the darkness, will involve a corruption of power with sex, drug, and elixirs. So it's a typical experience of Jupiter and Scorpio. A personal experience, when I once had a transit of Jupiter in Scorpio back, I think, in 2005. And that's when I dive very deeply into exploring conspiracy theories. And so, the whole Illuminati agenda and how, the superpower behind the scenes are controlling everything. I don't know if some of you are probably very familiar with this kind of thing. It's all over the internet and it's only growing. Um, and I remember, on the one hand, it was very Jupiter in Scorpio because it was all this shadow knowledge about what's really going on and the misuse of power, some kind of secret demonic agenda to destroy the world, and people turning into reptiles and sex slaves. And I remember how it basically, was very compelling on many levels, but it was also so dark that it made me depressed. It affected the psyche. And and so, gradually what I realized was that there's a level of paranoia in those conspiracy theories that are using the same techniques to brainwash people as, modern politics or organized religion. We see people subscribing to these very, very intense scenarios without really tangible proof. But someone wrote and someone saw, and pieces, bits and pieces that are glued together to make an extraordinary theory. So there are bits of truth that are somehow glued together to create whatever the author's story hold true. And that's a very Jupiter in Scorpio type of um, of use, because it uses suspicion, it uses distrust to gain trust. I'm going to give you the secret. I'm going to give you, whatever you see in the newspaper is wrong. Look at this. This is the real deal. And so there you go into that rabbit hole, and God knows, where you end up. Is that more reliable? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. So in a true Jupiter in Scorpio fashion, you also doubt the conspiracy theorist, and you don't get carried away just because, you know, there's a claim to know. Um, but it was very much in the vein of this, secret knowledge. So you can expect people with this signature to go through a crisis in belief, whether, there could be some sexual abuse that is used, you know, where there's some kind of spiritual justification, in the most grotesque expression. It's, if you sleep with me, you're going to sleep with God type of nonsense and delusion. But that's how the Scorpio Jupiter works. It brings sexuality with spirituality. It's very much the transformative snake. Now, in a positive way, it's not abuse, but it's that alchemy. It's that a capacity to transform darkness into light and lead into gold. So these people can be alchemists in many ways. Um, and if it is again very conscious, you are going to have very deep transformation and potentially the use of sexuality to access very deep revelations. So it is about connecting the higher mind with the heart and the root. Now, as far as truth and no compromise, Jupiter in Scorpio can be brutal in the truth, because it does bring, the inconvenient truth. Now we talk about the inconvenient truth that is authentic, and the inconvenient truth that's just paranoia. So we need to know, where is this escalating? How we can get carried away in negativity as much as we can get carried away by, fanciful promises. But usually Um, with the transits in our eighth house on our Pluto, there's some kind of shocking truth, something that we need to acknowledge that can redefine the way we look at things and make our decisions. Um, I think, this gives you a good understanding of the Scorpio archetype here. And what I can add is that once the person is accomplished and has gone through this shadow work to recapture, something of depth and authenticity, um, it's going to be confirmed knowledge. It's going to be tested knowledge and deep wisdom that can change people's lives. Jupiter in Sagittarius in the ninth house, which is happening now. I'm just gonna look at your questions for a moment. Harumi says, I have Jupiter and Pluto in conjunction in the ninth house. All you have described resonates very much. Well, it would be interesting if you do want to share your own stories and your experience with these transits and natal positions. You can write on email. That would be a good exercise, because always, 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 whatever you study needs to, test it in reality. See how it works in people's lives. Thank you. Now, Jupiter in Sagittarius, that sense of sovereignty is going to be, think about the maximum effectiveness of Jupiter. So there is here a deep inner knowing that whatever we see is just, 10% of the reality. That most of the truth is beyond the material world, the material dimension. So people born with Jupiter in Sagittarius don't only rely on physical proof. There's a deep knowing. I know there's more to life than this. I know there's, I could be a superstar. I know that, there are deeper spiritual truth to be uncovered. So there's some kind of internal conviction that is not just, coming from nowhere. If we look at past lives, these are people who may have access deeper spiritual realms or a greater potential, whether it is in a business setting or whether it is, whatever house that Jupiter will be in is a place where basically it brings a lot of enthusiasm, because if there is more, let's go and get it. So that there's a hunger with Jupiter in Scorpio, in Sagittarius. Just we're gonna quiet the cat. So basically, the sovereignty here is, first of all, encouraging people, encouraging ourselves to go farther, to explore life, to get out of your comfort zone. It's almost, like saying, to people, don't stay where you are. Life is much greater. It's fantastic. It is a deep experience to be here on this planet. So there's really a sense of mission, of higher purpose, and a desire to, to explore the maximum of what life can offer. And as I said, that can be on all levels. If you have that in your seventh house, which is a relationship house, you will be fascinated by other people's beliefs and what they've done with their lives and how far they went. And you're going to learn to push your boundaries by associations with other people. So think about that freedom. There's a tremendous sense of freedom in knowing that life is actually something very magical, very powerful, very exhilarating, and you can gain a lot from it. So there's a natural confidence in this placement of Jupiter, but at the same time, we all know, the Jupiter paradigm is that you need to make mistakes in order to learn the truth. And what are the mistakes here? Wherever you have Jupiter in Sagittarius, there will be a risk to cause a lot of damage. It's like the kids, challenging their parents and thinking they know everything, and then, coming back with their tail between their legs and feeling humbled by whatever experience, because they hurt themselves, because, they wasted all the money, because whatever they tried didn't work. So there's on the one hand this tremendous understanding that we could push the boundaries, but it is also the greatest, in, all the other Jupiters have some kind of defense, protective measure, protective mechanism that, brings more reference to know more quickly, did I go too far? Let's backpedal and return to safety. But with Jupiter in Sag, like, you could go and go and go and go and not know that you're in the wrong path until it's too late. So there are no restraining mechanism. There's no monitoring. You are on your own, and it's between you and life, and God knows where you're going to end up. So on a positive side, these are people who will try the impossible. And it's going to be sometimes very successful. And these are the people who can make history because they tried, they dared, they explored. But then you're going to have those who, create negative karma. And like we say, there's a lot of waste of time, waste of resources in this particular placement. What do you do as an astrologer? Nothing. The person has to go through their process. They need to learn from experience. And Jupiter in Sagittarius should not be careful. It's not about being safe. It is about taking the plunge. Now, if the person doesn't have any spiritual reference with that Jupiter in Sag, it can become megalomania. It can become, excessive confidence that leads to bullying, that leads to self-righteousness, that leads to, excessive confidence that is not backed up by anything. So what I'm saying, no spiritual reference, is that's the key to Jupiter's expansion. It's not, you can't just grow in physical size. You need to grow because you understand there's a higher truth. That's your reference point. So as an astrologer, you're going to tell your client, yes, you're going to fall on your head and you're going to maybe get into debt, but that's the incarnation that you're into. Try to see this year. It's a very interesting year because this year Jupiter is in Sag and Saturn is in Capricorn. So you have that, very cautious Saturn in Capricorn that's going to monitor and test everything, and then Jupiter in Sag pushes everything out and wants to expand those boundaries. So try to see how you experience this year. If you gain ground, if your faith helped you prevail and maybe prove other people wrong. And maybe you spent more money, maybe you traveled more, maybe you took some risks, and you're happy that you took those risks, even though it wasn't very reasonable initially. And then see, if you had to pay some consequences. So what is the key to success with Jupiter in Sag? It's the difference between being right and wanting the truth. If you're interested in being right, you're going to crash because it's ego, it's arrogance. If you are interested in the truth, then those risks are going to be, you're going to be guided. You're not going to be on your own. There's going to be a higher reason for you, to do whatever you can. But try to see, if during these times you manage to reach a completely new potential. Did you make more money? Did you make more friends? Did you meet, unique people? Whatever house it was in, try to see if you manage to conquer new grounds in that domain. Now, ironically, and that's the way it always works with astrology, just as much as you can grow, Jupiter in Sag can also bring fake. What is fake? What is inauthentic? It can bring lies, literally. So we transcend into higher realms, but if we don't have any spiritual reference, this expansion becomes nourished by delusions. So it's very important to see how, what drives this. In a typical way, if you want to again hear someone with Jupiter in Sag, they can be very enthusiastic and open many doors. And the way they look at life is how people compromise on themselves. Why do they settle for so little? And why, what is their true meaning? Why do they settle for poverty? Like there's a fight against poverty with Jupiter in Sag, and it's poverty of mind, it's poverty of spirit, it's the nitpicky. They can't stand that. let's look at the big vision. Let's see what's really important. But then you're going to have another type who are going to be, you know, always right. You can't argue with them. They're always going to win the arguments. They're never going to admit um, their own shortcomings. They're always going to twist things in a positive way. It, 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 it verges on the bipolar. Now, bipolar is obviously a deeper step into this abyss. Usually, in order to see bipolarism, you need Neptune and Jupiter involved. So if the Jupiter in Sag is in the 12th house, or Jupiter and Neptune, you have a whole generation born in 1971, 72, with both Jupiter and Neptune in Sag, as well as 1983, 4-ish. And so these folks, in a positive way, can have an incredible spirit and deep wisdom and knowledge. But on the downside, they they may not know how to land back. They may not know how to actually live in the material world. So they become intoxicated by um, something, that search, the maximum, to a point of really intense damage and destruction to themselves and to their environment. So what is bipolarity? Mania, excess, ecstasy. They become addicted to ecstasy. And I mean that on a spiritual level. And life always seemed to be so small in comparison to the ecstasy. So these can be great artists, these can be great philosophers, these can be, people with tremendous potential, but they don't know how to manage the day to day. And it becomes a mental health problem. So that's the potentially dark side of Jupiter in Sagittarius. And if we speak of the truth, again, it's a very naked truth. It's very, it's always that balance between wishful thinking versus truth. What I want to be true, what is actually true. I think that, that brings it to completion for this for this particular piece. And now, if we move into the next phase, which is going to be Jupiter in Capricorn, Jupiter Saturn to some extent, Jupiter in the 10th house. That's a very interesting scenario. People usually, astrologers tend to have a very negative idea about Jupiter in Capricorn, because Capricorn is considered to be very restrictive and Jupiter is expansive, and how can they work together? And it's it's kind of a contradictory combination. But we need to understand from an evolutionary astrology point of view, understand the intention. What's the role of Jupiter in Capricorn? So it's really about mastery. it is really about establishing that truth. So the sovereignty of people born with Jupiter in Capricorn is experience. You know, they come from past life where they were teachers, where they were leaders, where they had tremendous presence and authority in whatever field they were associated with. And of course, particularly in fields that have to do with entrepreneurship or academia, wisdom, and knowledge. And as I said, it can reflect mastery. Now, one of the things you know that needs to happen with Jupiter in scope in Capricorn is that not only do you come with knowledge, but you need to serve as a role model. So there's a lot of pressure to really live your truth, to really test it, and so people can see you as an example of whatever you are preaching. And that's the big test of Jupiter in Capricorn, is live this truth, own it, and show us that it actually brings result, because that's always what Capricorn wants, is show me the numbers, you know, show me that you have some results and that we can apply this theory. So if they manage to do that, they will be incredibly gifted people with deep insights and and a lineage of teachers. So this is basically the position of a guru, who is not only bringing a body of knowledge, but living it and living by example. So someone we can learn from, not just by listening to them, but emulating them. At the same time, because it's such a high test of integrity and a high test of resolve, it has its obvious traps and its obvious challenges. So Jupiter in Capricorn can definitely be under scrutiny. So if we speak about daring, think of that mountain goat. Jupiter in Capricorn can become, the presidents and the top of the status in society. They can reach the maximum in their governance, in their leadership, in their mastery. So think about an artist born with Jupiter in Capricorn. This is an artist that is going to bring a lot of inspiration, but in a way that can be measured. He's going to come with a science of art. That capacity to bring higher knowledge into physical form is very compelling. So the downside of that is when they don't manage to do that, and they don't walk their talk, and you end up having people who say, do as I say, not as I do. So they don't leave according to their own theories. They don't, they can't follow their own ideas, and it becomes a source of corruption. So they can become so successful, or so, there can be so much pressure in the role that they lead, that they cannot admit mistake again. So these are people who can end up putting a facade where any sign of vulnerability is undercover, it's hidden, because they need to show that mastery. It's like you're a master or a loser, there's no in between. The same way, they are going to be very tough students. They're going to challenge their teachers. On the one hand, they are looking for a teacher. You know, Jupiter in Capricorn is kind of looking, where is my guru? Who is my role model? I need someone who can bring all these pieces together and show me the truth. So there's a need to grow under the guidance of masters, to become myself a master. You know, as Yogi Bhajan was saying, I'm not here to create students, I'm here to create teachers. And that's a very Jupiter in Scorpio statement. So you're on both sides of the equation. You want to be a teacher, you need a good teacher to become a teacher. And in that, there is a respect of authority. Unlike, you know, Jupiter in Scorpio, who will dethrone the authority, who will lose trust in authority, or Jupiter in Sag, who will follow their own faith and convictions, and you know will have a hard time receiving guidance from a person. Jupiter in Capricorn has that humility um, to be guided, to respect the master. And sometimes you know you have to check with your client, is there, you know, if they have found their masters, are they also becoming the master, or are they just followers? Do they lose themselves in that guidance, or do they eventually, you know, get to the point where um, they become themselves the leaders? And then you always have, remember the mythological story of Zeus with Kronos. Zeus eventually killed his father. And you know, the battle between Jupiter and Saturn is also the battle between free will and fate in the ancient world. In today's world, with the outer planet, fate and free will is also a Pluto-Neptune affair. Neptune is fate, Pluto is free will, but it is captured in the more mundane level on a day-to-day basis by Jupiter. I want to do what I want to do. I want to manifest my vision. And Saturn says, there's a bigger story. It's not just up to you. There's a higher order that you need to abide to. So that balance between fate and free will, between the new world and the old world, between Zeus and Kronos, you know, is very symbolic and mythological. And there is always a need eventually for people born with Jupiter in Capricorn to overthrow their leaders, their parent, their teacher. It doesn't have to be disrespectful. It doesn't have to be, you know, brutal. But it's the same way that a child needs to distance themselves from their parents in order to become adults, and they need to own their own authority. The same way with Jupiter in Capricorn, you need to become your own teacher. And because of that, you need to stand on the shoulders of your own teacher. You need to outgrow your own teacher. And that's sometimes a tall order if your teacher is, very at the top of the mountain. So, like I said, it could happen by a clash of titans, the big long war between Jupiter and Saturn that lasted, very long. Or it could happen in a very progressive way where the student eventually matures and develop their own perspectives. When you say overthrow, can this be considered a transcendence? I don't know what you mean exactly by transcendence, but it sounds right. What I mean essentially is that the student need to go beyond the teacher. They're not just repeating the teacher. They need to, absorb whatever the teacher got and expand on that. Yes, confidence in their own experience and self-knowledge. Now, when you write, uh, Eileen, make sure you select all panelists and attendees so that everyone else can read your question as well, because you selected only panelists. Now, in a typical way, Jupiter in Capricorn, derives knowledge from the tradition, from the elders, from the ancestors. So as we are now moving into this transit, it's the year, 2020, there's going to be a very important need to honor the ancestors, to honor our founding fathers, the teachers of astrology and mothers of astrology, and understand that we are standing on the shoulders of giants, which is interesting, a Capricornian concept. But there's a need to respect, to honor the tradition, and that's something that's very strong in Eastern traditions. I've taught many places around the world, and I can see the very different cultural expression. If you go to India or Japan or um, even in Turkey, you see how people honor their teachers and how important the teacher is. And that's very Jupiter in Capricorn. It's even though I'm going to be a teacher myself, I'm thankful. I don't take ever the teacher for granted and I don't cross them. And some people may say, well, it's very submissive, but it's not only submissive, it's respectful. It's very understanding the tradition. In the West, especially in the United States, it's very different. It's very much like, prove to me. There's a bit of an entitlement of, um, I'm outgrowing the teacher because I already know all this. So there's more of a um, in a way, in the West we are spoiled and we get things very quickly, and there can be a sense of entitlement that leads to a lot of disrespect, or you lose respect very easily. The same way, we don't trust governments, we don't trust any authority figures. It's much more, you're constantly under scrutiny in the West. And that sense of overthrowing is much more deeply ingrained because there's more individualism and that need to become yourself, uh, the leader or the governor or the president or the teacher. And it's I don't know what chart to look at that, if it's in the chart of a country or what's Western civilization in this context. But it's if we look now at the transit of Jupiter is in Capricorn, in a positive way, it would be restoring the integrity, the lineage of whatever tradition you're following. It can be a good time for a pilgrimage. It's true for all the time that this Cancer Capricorn nodes are active, but as far as Jupiter is concerned, is especially the spiritual ancestors. So make it count in your own life. Now, what is the difficult side of Jupiter in Capricorn? What is the price of mastery? Think about someone, who has this symbol and is perhaps coming from a past life where they were doctors or leaders or big teachers. They come with status. The big problem, one of the consequences of that is that it can be a type of communication and conviction that can easily become self-righteous and prejudice. You'll see many people with Jupiter in Capricorn that will dismiss things outright just because it sounds stupid to them. And they don't really test it. They don't do the Capricorn work of really the science. What's the science? Let's be rigorous about our confirmation of knowledge. So they can gain that confidence intuitively, quote unquote. And then it's hard because they have that authority, and when they become dismissive, it's hard to fight back. Their words can be very radical, and they can put people down in brutal ways. So any kind of prejudice, it can be a prejudice against astrology, against any different spiritual expression, about, let's say I'm a parent with Jupiter in Capricorn and my child wants to become an artist. I'm going to come with my Jupiter in Capricorn and categorically tell my child that this is nonsense and you can't make a living out of this. So they want their hard proof, and they can, come from a position of know it all. And they can back it up because usually they know a lot. And it seems like their word is experience. So there could be a lot of damage there with thinking you're right and thinking you have the authority to decide the absolute of right and wrong. And so we have to be very careful, those of us who may be born with that, or those of us who are in communication with someone with Jupiter and Capricorn, um, that prejudice. So let's see a question. Eileen says, I was born in 81 and have Jupiter conjunct Saturn in Libra, almost exact. All of this resonates. Thank you. And it's going to be a big year for you because not only is it in Capricorn, but it will conjunct Saturn again, December 2020. So, we'll look at examples, but I believe we covered uh, this portion of it. Now, moving into our next archetype is going to be Jupiter in Aquarius. And Jupiter in aspect to Uranus, and Jupiter in the 11th house. So this is a very powerful combination because both Uranus, Aquarius, and Jupiter relate to the higher world. Remember that Uranus is Jupiter's grandfather. It's the father of Saturn. And so there's access here to an even vaster, more ancient, even though Uranus has a lot to do with modernity, and Aquarius has to do with the new and the innovation. Um, it's the capacity to tap into such a vast network of intelligence, of knowledge, of information and wisdom. So people born with this are usually, I mean, I'm generalizing, but there's definitely an IQ advantage. You know, it's a vast spirit. Um, and if we say that Jupiter in Sag feels a little small in this world, like it feels that this world is a little too small for them, Jupiter in Aquarius or in with Uranus are completely out of body and are flying to other dimensions, other realities, not necessarily in a mystical way, even in a physical way. They are ahead of their time. They scan things. The the Aquarius quality brings electricity, speed, clarity, like you can see things from the bird eye view, the big picture. So these are tremendously gifted people usually. And if it doesn't manifest on a higher mind level, it can also manifest in networking. These are people who can be very connected socially. They know everybody. They know the important people. Very social and with good connections. So it can apply on a more mundane level as well. There's a social dimension to Aquarius, the friends, the the groups and so forth. So they can be part of organizations. They can be part of kind of important circles. But the sovereignty here is, I know, a very deep wisdom, a very new wisdom. Now, what is the challenge of Uranus and Jupiter? I will actually send you an article I wrote on this configuration. It was published in the Astrology Journal of the UK. And it is definitely about what is the new frontier. Think about Jupiter in Sag exploring the magnificence of life, the potential of life, and Jupiter in Aquarius exploring beyond the realm of Saturn. So going to a place that transcends time in many ways. We're getting very close to Neptune, to Pisces. So there's something quite galactic about it. And it's interesting, there's a generation born in 1983-ish with Jupiter in Sag, conjunct Uranus in Sag, and very brilliant people. Think about that combination. These are people who cannot be on any leash whatsoever. They need their freedom of exploration. They are researchers. They are natural philosophers. But how does it work? What's the mechanism? What you need to understand is that Jupiter in Aquarius actually wants to bring science into spirituality. So Aquarius is detached. It objectifies everything. Whereas Jupiter is so fiery, emotional, attached. My belief, I know it's true. So that's the reason why they can be so smart and so, mentally developed is usually because they come from past lives where they had the opportunity to combine science with spirituality. So science of the mind, what we know, and what we can learn by observation, and the cosmic riddles. So in a very mundane way, these are people with, again, very strong and polished critical thinking. They're not the ones who are going to go on blind faith. And it's a little bit of a contradiction because it's such a vast configuration. It has such vast wings and can really travel, very high and see the truth in its totality. But it also is, a configuration that is full of doubt. It's the critical mind, the scientist, who will constantly question spiritual matters. And in a very Aquarian way, they can be very sarcastic about spiritual matters. Why? Because Aquarius comes up with new realizations. And so these are the people who will come and say, we know now that, these diseases weren't caused by angry gods. There was a fungus, a virus, a microbe that led to the contamination. So they're going to usually neutralize, or maybe that's the right word, or debunk a lot of, so to speak, mystical experiences. And they're going to bring the science behind what happened. So, I'm going to share the story that in a very Jupiterian way, I had my own experience with a ghost. And a ghost attacked me when I was sleeping and literally held me on the bed. And I couldn't move for several minutes until I ordered that ghost to leave. Now, Jupiter in Aquarius will say, yes, there is a phenomenon like that when you sleep, that there's some chemical reaction in your brain that cause hallucinations and can lead to what we call sleep paralysis. So my ghost story is turned into some kind of chemical imbalance of the time and an explained phenomena of sleep paralysis. So there's an internal battle between knowing things that cannot be yet explained and wanting to explain them, because ultimately everything is explainable. If you keep researching, if you keep really loyal to the truth, you'll find how it works and why it works. But before you reach that balance, Jupiter in Aquarius will constantly fight between reason and belief, between intuition and critical thinking. When and so naturally, what happens in the spiritual plane is that they will want to find scientific proof for everything that's in the Bible. You know, they will be the one who say that, you know, religion is the opium for the masses. And guess what? Karl Marx, who said that, it's a quote from Karl Marx, was had Uranus in Sagittarius, which is a mutual reception of Jupiter in Aquarius. Not only that, he had Jupiter in Capricorn in the 11th house. Let's actually look at this chart because it's important. I think I have it here. Yeah. So you can see the chart here of Karl Marx and Uranus in Sag with Jupiter in the 11th house in Capricorn. So you can see his Jupiter in Capricorn coming with very firm convictions, and a master. He studied political systems, all these trines, his eclipse, Sun Moon conjunction on the North Node in Taurus, which has to do with the whole economic system that he wanted to challenge and reform. But what did this Jupiter in the 11th house and Uranus in Sag lead to is that communism became completely detached from any form of spirituality. And that's what all the Soviet and communist country were led, that spirituality was in a way a weakness. It was indoctrination. It was something irrational. So this is an example of how Jupiter in the 11th house or in Aquarius can become atheist. Science can kill spirituality to a point where they're going to explain rationally why people get carried away with belief, why they believe in this nonsense. They're going to bring the science to debunk any kind of belief. But if they do work in a more mature way and not with prejudice, but from a really, if you adopt a really scientific point of view, you will realize that the science will lead you to spirituality as opposed to remove you from spirituality. Because spirituality is part of the truth. And if you're a truth seeker, it will take you there. Think about Einstein, who basically said that there is probably a way. He didn't he didn't get there. He didn't realize his intention, but his intention was to scientifically prove the existence of God. So that's when you merge science and spirituality. Let's see what Einstein, where his Jupiter was. Here it is in Aquarius, opposing Uranus. So you see here how Jupiter in Aquarius in the ninth house, this masterful genius who came with, an incredible IQ, used science, but understood, like through the science, through his authentic research and observation of life, he came to the conclusion that not everything is mechanical, that not everything is material, that there is a higher intelligence. So this brings the marriage of both. And you can see, because of the opposition of Uranus and Jupiter, you can see that at first it was probably conflictual, that he didn't know how to reconcile these forces. And he didn't manage to reach, his formula. But great minds, sometimes, the downfall of a great mind is the know-it-all syndrome. Now, another interesting example, not example, but the reason why Jupiter can be so doubtful when in Aquarius is because they actually want to bring new knowledge. They tap into reservoirs, new reservoirs of intellectual, philosophical, spiritual resources that can contradict what the past was established. So these are people who, in a very Aquarian way, need to bring reforms, need to change the way we think. And these are people with Jupiter in Aquarius who can change mentalities, who can change people's way of looking at life. So Mercury is going to teach you data. It's going to teach you that Pluto is at that distance, and it's going to take 248 years to complete a cycle, gives you information. But Jupiter gives you convictions, what you actually believe in. And as we said earlier, what you believe in is how you're going to lead your life. Sagittarius trine Aries. So those folks with Jupiter in Aquarius can alter how we interpret things, how we perceive God, how we perceive astrology, how we perceive what is true from what isn't. And because of that, they have that capacity to change what's being done on the field, for better and worse, obviously. But the intention here is to upgrade our conditioning. It's to deconstruct first what we're so emotionally attached to bring a brighter, clearer point of view on what life is about. And so naturally, like I said, they will be those who are going to have that critical thinking and can go through phases again where they reject completely anything that has a spiritual essence. until, eventually they reach their own realization. So there's a reforming quality to it. So you can bet that many people born with Jupiter in Aquarius were, in a past life considered heretics. You know, they were against the church because they doubted. And you see both the Scorpio and the Aquarius are going to be the fierce challengers. Scorpio is going to look at what's hidden, what are they not telling us? And what's the emotional component and what is the emotional attachment to the belief? Whereas Jupiter in Aquarius is simply going to deflate. So the Aquarius deflates the Jupiter. Your big balloon, your big enthusiasm. There's nothing behind it. There's nothing to support it. And they can be basically uh, people who live like that, more on the rational side. Um, on another level, as we said, Jupiter in Aquarius is about also connecting and bridging between different ideas. So it's not only my capacity to understand, it's creating a whole body of knowledge from bringing all the geniuses together. It's an astrology conference where all the big speakers are coming together and sharing their information, and it enriches the whole community. So there's something very fertile about it, and expansive, because you're collecting information from so many different sources that it becomes, a whole movement. It, you build you build a civilization, and in a very, positive way. Jupiter in Aquarius is the visionary. They can have faith that the future is, has promise. They can be those who help us create a better future. So, it's a very powerful combination in that sense. In the article I'll send you, you'll also see an example I use of a lady born in the early 80s with that Jupiter Uranus in Sag. And she is one of the contenders to fly to Mars in, I believe, 2025. So she's been training for, I believe now, 5, 7 years, and is going to be one of the people, if she's selected, on a manned mission to Mars. So that's again a Jupiter Uranus, the last frontier. Um, Going to another planet, that's really talk about space travel. So if we're going to have Jupiter in Aquarius in 2021, it's going to be one of the short cycles of Jupiter in its cycle. It's going to stay only a few months in Pisces and Aquarius. However, it could be a time where we branch out and there's some kind of breakthrough in space travel. But understand the symbolic aspect of space travel. It's going there physically, but it's also traveling to completely new dimensions spiritually. Um, the again a possible potentially dangerous side to this is utopian ideals. You know, Jupiter in Aquarius can have so much faith in the vision that they can get lost there. So, it's going to Mars and then not knowing how to get back here. What we see basically um, is people who can get carried away with futuristic thoughts and advanced vision that are not yet uh, integrated into our systems. In some ways, these are the pioneers who can even change our DNA, because in order for us to live in the future, we need to also change chemically. Just like someone in the 13th century cannot be transposed to the 21st century. They may die immediately because the frequency today is completely different than the frequency that was a few centuries ago. So, in a way, Jupiter in Aquarius prepares us for the future and can already create all kinds of physical changes so we can adapt to the vision. But at times, it is either premature, so it's moving too fast and crashing, or it is, when Jupiter overrides Aquarius and the faith in my vision becomes dogmatic. And you have, cult leaders who will tell you about, the date for ascending. And they come with authority about how everything's going to be and what's right. So they bring, it's very much the Scientology model, something very futuristic, but not very grounded, not very integrated. Let's look at his chart, because I'm sure he's one of. Try again. Let's try another file. Bear with me. There it is. There it is. So Ron Hubbard, who is the founder of Scientology, Jupiter in Scorpio, the secret knowledge in the 11th house, that whole body of knowledge around, very futuristic and about extraterrestrial life. So branching into other models of life. And in many ways, brilliant, but in other ways, distorted. And distorted because, it's a model that had tremendous difficulty reconciling spirituality with safety and emotional stability. And you see, his Saturn is on the North Node, which shows a test of integrity. So interesting to see these visionaries. He managed to build a new church, Jupiter on the nodes, and it's a church full of secrets and full of mystical knowledge and, in the Scorpio. But then you also have all the elite and the networking and the Tom Cruise and John Travolta and how, he managed to, whether he by himself or his associate, create this kind of elite clique, which is very Aquarian. You know, those of us who will survive the disaster, we're going to have the spaceship to fly to that other galaxy. So interesting, three very important figures, Marx, Einstein, and Hubbard, public figures who are very involved in the way of thinking, how we interpret life, changing to an extent or another the lives of many people. And last but not least, Jupiter in Pisces. Now, I want to remind you, Jupiter will be in Pisces in 2022, and it's going to conjunct Neptune at 23 Pisces. So both rulers of Pisces conjunct together on that degree. What can it be about? So the sovereignty of Jupiter in Pisces is the knowledge, similar to Sag, that there is something beyond the physical. So there's a deep spiritual yearning of some sort, a need to, to understand that the truth is not just in what we can touch with our senses. So they also are open to abstract explorations of the unconscious, of the mind. And the sovereignty is also in our own relationship with life. It's almost as if on a deep level, there can be an initial trust in God. Whatever happens, we see, drama and regimes rising and falling and suffering and all kinds of trials and tribulations. There's some faith in Jupiter in Pisces that it's all good, that ultimately it all is going to fall into place. So they don't get attached to the details of, temporary suffering. They can endure because there is a larger vision of something all-encompassing, more global, that they trust. So in some ways, there can be a feeling that life is good, despite the challenges. And you can interpret that differently. Some people will say, yeah, you say life is good because you're not looking at what's going on. So there's a level of denial in your optimism and in your trust. Or is it deeper wisdom that indeed all the little challenges and even death and suffering and evil, they don't last? They're not the one who have the last word. So you have both deep wisdom and you also have a level of perhaps neglect in not addressing day-to-day matters, but living on that faith that it was good. God created this place because it's good. So when you have that kind of confidence, life, can work also in a positive way sometimes. So if you are in that mindset, in that conviction that it's all for the best, maybe you are a happier person at the core. Maybe you don't get carried away by the dramas of the day. And you're able to kind of stabilize and neutralize and center yourself. Obviously, this is also depending on the level of evolution of a person. You can have some people with Jupiter in Pisces who will just, whatever you say, they're going to refer back to the Bible and tell you this and this and that is why there are hurricanes, and explain everything and justify everything because there's some kind of religious reference. You're going to also see those who are just not seeking. They're fine. They're not trying to look for the truth. The truth is what is. Like, what is there more to search? So they can be very passively dwelling in what is, not ambitious in particular, not trying to, get the next position or gain status or um, conquer the world. Like this contentment, which, like I said, is both a gift and can be a curse. Because in some ways they may not really look under the surface. It can be a superficial acceptance because they don't know there's more. So it's, as a practitioner yourself, it's important for you to try to see where is the source of that form of acceptance. Is it denial? Is it just the easy way? Or is it really a natural connection that works for the person? In that sense, these are folks that can easily ride on every horse, you know, ride every river, surf every surf, and always make the best of whatever comes their way. There's an opportunity um, to improvise and put a positive experience, bring the positive experience to whatever is around them. Now, it's not always so smooth. But to begin with, if we speak about the daring approach, you'll see two types of Jupiter in Pisces. You'll see one type who just doesn't dare anything. Very quiet types of people. They don't need to express, they don't need to seek. They just stay where they are. There's something very passive. And because of that, they can also be bullied into things or pushed into things. Um, if you are not, if you're taking things for granted and you think everything's good or you don't even think if it's good or not, you just live your life going with the motion, people are going to make decisions for you. So they may be born in a reality, in a family where there were louder voices around them, where there was a brother or there was a parent who had a very fiery or dominant personality, and the Jupiter in Pisces just went with it. They followed whatever was said, whatever was believed, to a point, of losing themselves. Another thing that can happen is that they don't seize opportunities. Things can come their way and they're going to be, no, I don't need that. Why do I need to travel more? It's easier to just stay where I am. So they're not seeking more education, more expansion. For them, expansion is kind of overrated. Like that whole Jupiter ecstasy, it's it's not as good as it sounds. They prefer the simple. Now, again, this can be deep wisdom, simplicity, live close to nature. Don't try to constantly more, more, more. Be content with who you are and what you have. Or it comes from ignorance, and you're depriving yourself, your family, your people from worthy opportunities. Get out of your little bubble. Again, you have to see where it's coming from. Ignorance or wisdom. Sometimes it's a mix of both. But the person who has traveled and now decides that they don't want to travel anymore and simplify their lives is probably going to be wiser than someone who just upright, up front, just refuses to take risks and go places. But you will see people with this signature that at some point in their life they're going to wake up and they're going to go through, there's some Pluto transit or some Martian transit that kind of ignites their sleepy Jupiter. And they realize, wow, I never did that. And I, you know, didn't know it was possible. So they suddenly wake up to a larger reality full of promises, things that they could have done and it wasn't available or they didn't get it. And so it's going to be like an exciting journey of awakening and realization that there is more, that the more is not necessarily bad. And then there's those who may have come from past lives where they went way too far, wherever that was. They, maybe they followed a guru, maybe they explored by seas and drowned. There's some kind of trauma associated with expansion. Like they paid a price for expansion. Um, they invested in a business and went too quick, too big, and drowned. So there's the drowning aspect of Pisces in Jupiter functions. Drowning in false beliefs, drowning in false promises, drowning in excesses and excessive optimism. And that can also be a reason why they're like not going anywhere anymore and they just want what's in front of them and they're content because there can be a memory of getting carried away. Now, this is obviously, if you want to learn more about this particular configuration and Jupiter, Neptune, and the transit coming up, it's obviously in the book I wrote about Neptune in the 12th house. So if you're interested in that, definitely explore that chapter more extensively. Now, the transition to the spiritual plane is interesting. I mean, there can be that, wow, finally, I understand why I'm here. Things come and make sense. So a spiritual awakening is water in a desert because they may feel like otherwise life, you know, is not just about waking up and surviving. There must be more. So they need to understand that there's a good intention behind everything that's around them. They need to validate that. And if they may have experienced a miracle, maybe they were healed against the odds. So in a spiritual plane, they may get in touch with spiritual forces in a way that gives them access to understand, to get in touch with, to communicate with the divine. A revelation, an apparition, a miraculous something that gives them the understanding that there's there are stronger forces around us. And so this is true to people born with Jupiter, Neptune as well. This can lead to a deep spiritual life. On the other hand, as there is always another hand, it's interesting to see that Jupiter in Pisces can go through also the most severe disillusionment. As much as they can experience those miraculous apparitions or experiences, they can also go through a phase where anything they believed in dissolves completely, and they are left with nothing. And I mean nothing, which means a complete void of meaning. So you, as an astrologer, need to find out, is the void of meaning because they're not seeking anything and they never ask any question? Or is the void of meaning coming from a serious disappointment and the fear of having been gullible, which leads to a reality where they are so afraid of getting carried away. They are so afraid of losing themselves in anything spiritual that they say no to everything before they even open the door, if they open it. So there can be a complete contraction and cynicism because God betrayed me, and things like, how can there be a God if so many children are abused sexually, or so many horrors are happening around us? So there's suddenly they see that their good and jolly version of life is shattered by some harsh truth, the diseases and the abuse and the suffering, the shadow. And what is actually happening is that Pisces dissolves wishful thinking. So anything that I, wanted to believe because it sounded better than somebody else's version is now, in a very surprising way, taken away from me. And I can go through bitterness and a feeling of, not trusting the universe, and reducing that to just focusing on day-to-day details. So from one extreme of one Jupiter in Pisces actually, having an audience with the divine and having a direct experience with, these invisible forces, to a place of reduction and holding on to only the physical because I'm so afraid of getting lost again in anything spiritual that I'm going to focus on whatever is material only. So one extreme to another. And you'll see those people who are going to be, in a way, panicking about spirituality. Always remember the experience of drowning. And the defense mechanism is, okay, I'm going to focus on having breakfast in the morning, going to work, coming back and sleeping, because the rest of it is too much. I'm overwhelmed by these spiritual worlds. That's not the end of the story, because they need to eventually reconcile with the spiritual, with the divine, but who knows how long it's going to take? Lifetimes, sometimes. um, Ultimately, they can regain trust by letting go of both the fear and the ecstasy. Like, it's not about, yeah, God, miracles, and it's not about rejection either. Just be, just go through life, open minded, and then life is going to talk to you again. And you're going to see the synchronicities and how things happen in a way that you maybe not didn't anticipate. So you definitely need to speak to your client about not making a decision, but being open-minded without being gullible, just open-minded. So if we look at the next conjunction of Jupiter and Neptune, think about the fact that Pisces has a lot to do with what is fated, what is beyond free will and control. It's about the larger forces. So some people during that conjunction will experience an incredible revelation, an awakening. They will see the truth. They will have an audience with some kind of divine, ethereal, otherworldly um, truth. And other people are going to go through some feeling of being completely overwhelmed by that Jupiterian wave coming at them. What do I mean by that? Because Pisces has to do with what we cannot control, the larger forces. It can also mean that we're overwhelmed. So there's something so dramatic, so big, that it leaves us helpless. Think about a flood. Jupiter, Neptune in Pisces. Everything is flooded. Sea levels rising. Ocean, Pisces. Uncontrollable amounts of water. And again, uncontrolled amounts of drought. Always with one polarity, there's another. So too much water in some places, no water in other places. So you can expect climate extremes during that time. But at the same time, think about it symbolically, where some people are drowning in some kind of spiritual pursuit, and other people are completely dehydrating and living without, any drop of spirit. What is the meaning of all that, and how to prevail through that is to definitely, from a Pisces point of view, stop dominating. It's about becoming part as opposed to controlling. Be part of the ecosystem. Be part of the stream and participate. But it's about collectively learning not to see ourselves above nature, above life, and dropping the sense of entitlement. So if we have faith and if we are, focused and grounded spiritually, it is going to be a massive wave, but it's going to take us very far instead of crushing us and drowning us. It will be a powerful force that lifts us to a completely new revelation existence. So the challenge is to listen and to dare follow the wave. Now, what does that mean? See what house it's in your chart. If some people will have that wave come through their relationships, and there's going to be a whirlwind, a new revelation. Are they going to say yes? Are they going to, follow the truth as opposed to security? So it is going to be a time when you're going to have to trust a higher intention and take that risk, take that leap of faith, because you're not going to have all the answers right away. You're going to have to face the unknown, accept it. So interesting times. I want to just briefly, I know we were ahead of time a little bit, but I wanted to show you some example charts. This is the chart of Van Gogh, and that's the time that he actually mutilated himself and cut off his hair after, some kind of angry episode with a friend, Gauguin. So you see, he's born with Jupiter on the South Node, and he was very religious, but also very inspired as a painter. And this happened during a Jupiter return. Now you would expect Jupiter return, I'm gonna sell all my paintings and make a lot of money. No, but it's a psychotic episode that is very much, related to a sense of invincibility, a Jupiterian delusion. It takes courage to chop your hair off. You need to really be in some kind of trance state, something grandiose taking over you, even if it is destructive. And that's what can happen with Jupiter in Sag, is that you can be so convinced and so blinded by whatever force is coming over you, even if it's negative, that you don't see, you lose perspective, and you do all kinds of crazy things. So you see both the glamour and the danger of that Jupiterian experience. And there's definitely, many signs of being bipolar in this chart, with Jupiter on the ascendant, on the south node, with the moon, square Neptune, square Mars in Pisces. He definitely lived in another world and had, tremendous difficulty in the physical, which was his genius and his suffering. So that's one example. This is another example of Martin Luther. So Martin Luther was, living in Germany, and he's also born with Jupiter on the south node. So a strong teacher, someone who led a spiritual life, who needed to believe in things. It's in Libra, which has to do with other people, synthesis of different beliefs, showing a different perspective on things. And if you know the history, it's very interesting because he is the one who reformed Christianity and led and created the Lutheran movement in Christianity. And what was it based on? First of all, this is an event when he had his revelation. While returning to university on a horseback after a trip home, I'm gonna make this bigger. Lightning bolts struck near him during a thunderstorm. He told his father he was terrified of death and divine judgment and cried out, "Help, Saint Anna. I will become a monk." And he came to view this cry for a help as a vow he would never break. So he left university, sold his book, and entered a monastery that summer of 1505. So that's the ignition point. And guess what? Jupiter's on his ascendant on the south node, an exact recurrence of Jupiter on the south node natally. And it's in Leo, which gives him a sense of purpose. You know, I know what I have to do. I have to become a monk. Now you also see, the north node is in Aries in the 9th house. So moving from the intellect, the university, to a spiritual life. Now, in his case, the ruler of the north node is Mars, back to the south node. Another story. But just for transits, see this activation, how powerful it is. Now, he's also born with 3 planets in Sag, including Mercury, Neptune conjunct. Now, he became a monk and he was ordained on that day, which we're going to look at tomorrow. But that's when he started his reforms. And one of the reasons he started the reform was that the Pope had this practice of indulgences where people could pay money to absolve some sins. And obviously, the church made a lot of money from that, and people felt good that, they were not going to hell. So he wrote to the bishop what we call the 95 Theses, protesting the sale of indulgences. He enclosed a letter, a copy of the Disputation of Martin Luther, the efficacy of indulgences, which comes to be known in the 95 Theses. Why does Pope, whose wealth today is greater than the wealth of the riches, build the Basilica of St. Peter with the money of the poor believer rather than with his own money? So he was talking about the fact that all these indulgences were basically milking the simple people, when in fact they were swimming in a lot of money. So when does this happen? When, interestingly, Jupiter was in Virgo. What did we say with Jupiter in Virgo? We mentioned that it's time for critical thinking. It's time to actually bring some common sense into the blind beliefs. So you see how he's bringing some very practical matters here that don't compute for him. And it also squares his natal Uranus in Sagittarius, objectifying the beliefs and wanting to create a reform, changing the spiritual belief, bringing new concepts. So the critical thinking, the dissatisfaction with the way things are managed and handled is going to be the beginning of a complete revolution in the church. And this is simultaneous to Uranus transit being in the house of Jupiter, the ninth house, opposing natal Jupiter, the nodes, and Mars. And this is only growing towards the MC, which will lead to him being excommunicated and starting his movement. Fascinating, I think. So, leaving you to these thoughts, and going to catch up tomorrow with our last session. Thank you for your patience and thank you for your time. I just see a couple of questions. We'll address them tomorrow. But yes, it's a very good example. Doreen Virtue has Neptune conjunct Jupiter. For a long time was a spokesman for Pollyanna spirituality and went through severe, massive disillusionment, switched to fundamental Christianism. Let's look at her chart tomorrow. And you can look her up if you don't know her, Doreen Virtue. Thank you, everyone. Susie said, this makes me laugh because my son has Jupiter in Aquarius conjunct Uranus. It's no accident that I'm his mother. We have some good discussion about faith versus science. Keep going. Take good care.